The handcuffs closed around Simone Carter's wrists while she was doubled over on the sidewalk. One hand pressed against the underside of her belly, her breath coming in short, broken pulses. "I am 33 weeks pregnant," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Please, I need my blood pressure checked right now." Officer Wade Kessler stood over her, hands on his hips, the 10:52 morning sun throwing his shadow across her body like a wall. "You will sit right there until I confirm this vehicle was not reported stolen," he said, his tone flat and almost bored. "I know exactly what I am doing." A bead of sweat rolled down Simone's temple. The edges of her vision had started to blur, a symptom she recognized immediately because she had read about it 100 times in the past 2 months. But nobody standing around her seemed to care. "You do not understand," she whispered. "If my blood pressure spikes any higher, I could seize right here on this pavement." Kessler glanced down at her the way a man glances at a puddle blocking his path, and then looked away. "Every woman who gets arrested suddenly claims she is dying," he said, turning back toward his patrol car. Nobody that morning in Magnolia Bluff Estates knew that the manila folder sitting on the back seat of the borrowed sport utility vehicle she had been driving carried 3 words that would decide Wade Kessler's entire future. The folder was labeled Patterns and Practices Review. But to understand how Simone Carter ended up on her knees on a stranger's sidewalk with a badge number pressed into her memory forever, you have to go back 6 hours to a Thursday morning that started like every other morning of her life for the past 2 years. Simone woke up before sunrise in a 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of Marietta, Georgia. The kind of apartment where the radiator clanked twice before it finally decided to work. She was 24 years old, and up until 2 years earlier, she had been a third-year law student with a nearly perfect transcript and a dream of becoming a public defender, someone who would stand up for people who could not stand up for themselves. All of that had folded quietly into a drawer the day her mother, Dolores Carter, was diagnosed with stage 4 kidney failure and told she needed dialysis 3 times a week for the rest of her life, however long that turned out to be. Simone had not hesitated. She still remembered the exact moment she made the decision, sitting in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, watching her mother's hands shake from exhaustion, and thinking, with a strange kind of calm, that some choices are not really choices at all. They are simply the next right thing standing in front of you. She withdrew from school 1 semester short of finishing her 3rd year, telling her professors she would be back, though even she was not sure she believed it at the time. She picked up 2 jobs, one at a laundromat that closed at midnight and another cleaning offices before sunrise, and eventually landed steady work as a housekeeper for one of the wealthiest men in the state of Georgia, a real estate developer named Marcus Delacroix, who owned a sprawling estate inside the gates of Magnolia Bluff, a private community built for people whose net worth had more zeros than Simone had ever seen on a single check. She dusted his marble staircases, ironed his linen shirts, and every single morning she reached up to touch the small pendant that rested against her collarbone. A tarnished silver turtle on a thin chain, the only thing her mother had ever given her that had come from a man Dolores refused to talk about. He was rich. Her mother had told her once, years ago, late at night, when the pain medication made her honest. "And he left us before you were even born. That necklace is the only proof he ever existed." What Simone did not know, and what nobody in that entire mansion had ever said out loud, was that Marcus Delacroix had noticed that same turtle pendant 3 different times in the past 8 months. And each time, something in his chest tightened in a way he could not explain. He was 61 years old, a widower twice over in a sense, having lost the only woman he ever truly loved to circumstances he still did not fully understand, and lost his own daughter to a decision that had never been his to make. He watched Simone from across rooms sometimes, quiet and thoughtful, and the household staff had started to whisper that Mr. Delacroix treated the new housekeeper differently than anyone else who had ever worked there. Nobody knew why. Not even Marcus was entirely sure why, not yet. The only person in that house who was kind to Simone without any hidden motive at all was Andre Booker, Marcus Delacroix's longtime driver, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s who had worked for the family for almost 20 years. Andre had noticed Simone struggling to catch the city bus after her shifts more than once, and without ever making a show of it, he started finding reasons to be near the front gate around the time she left, offering her a ride toward the hospital where her mother received treatment. He never asked questions. He simply showed up week after week the way a person shows up when kindness is not a transaction but a habit. That particular Thursday, Simone had a rare window between her cleaning shift and her mother's dialysis appointment. So she stopped by the modest house of a woman named Pearl Simmons, a former community organizer who had once worked security consulting for the Magnolia Bluff Homeowners Association before quietly resigning after raising concerns nobody wanted to hear. Pearl had been collecting resident complaints for months, quietly, patiently, documenting a pattern of officers treating black residents and their guests as suspects before they treated them as neighbors. Simone had agreed, almost as a favor, to drop the folder of statements off at a legal aid office on her way home. Since her route happened to pass right by it, she set the folder on the back seat of her sister's borrowed sport utility vehicle without a second thought. The way you set down a grocery bag, never imagining it would matter to anyone but the lawyers who eventually opened it. She never made it to the legal aid office. Officer Wade Kessler had been assigned to patrol the perimeter of Magnolia Bluff Estates for almost 4 years. A job he had gotten largely because his uncle, Sergeant Gary Poole, ran the private security division that contracted with the community's homeowners association. Kessler had a reputation, quiet but persistent, for stopping vehicles that did not, in his words, match the neighborhood. He pulled Simone over less than 200 yards from the front gate, claiming her license plate did not correspond to a registered resident vehicle, which was technically true since the sport utility vehicle belonged to her sister, who lived 3 towns away and had lent it to Simone for the week while her own car was in the shop. What started as a routine mistake turned into something else entirely within minutes. Simone offered to call her sister immediately to confirm ownership. Kessler refused to wait, saying the dispatcher was too busy to verify anything right then. He asked Simone to step out of the vehicle, and when she explained, calmly and clearly, that she was 33 weeks pregnant and needed to move slowly, he told her to hurry up anyway. A neighbor walking past with a stroller slowed down to watch, then quickened her pace again, the way people sometimes do when they sense trouble but do not yet understand how serious it is about to become. Simone tried once more, keeping her voice level, even as her pulse climbed. "Officer," she said, "I clean 3 houses right here in this community. I am not a threat to anyone." Kessler studied the registration papers in his hand as though they were written in a language he had already decided not to trust, then looked back up at her with an expression that seemed to have made up its mind about her long before she ever opened her mouth. Over his radio, Simone heard a familiar voice crackle through, telling Kessler to just follow procedure. "Son, take your time, do not let anybody rush you." That voice belonged to Sergeant Gary Poole, watching from a patrol vehicle parked farther down the street, close enough to see everything and choosing to do nothing. By the time Kessler decided Simone needed to be handcuffed and seated on the curb while he ran a more thorough check, her headache had become blinding. Her vision had started to swim at the edges, black spots creeping in from the corners, like ink spreading through water. She told him, again and again, that she had a diagnosed high-risk pregnancy, that her doctor had warned her just 2 weeks earlier about early signs of preeclampsia, a condition where blood pressure rises to dangerous levels and can, without warning, trigger seizures that threaten both mother and baby. Kessler heard none of it, or chose to hear none of it. He stood over her with his arms crossed, checking his watch, more concerned with finishing his shift report than with the woman shaking in front of him. By 10:45, 3 other patrol officers had arrived, drawn by Kessler's call for backup on a routine stop that should never have needed backup at all. One of them, a younger officer named Officer Reyes, crouched down beside Simone and asked quietly whether she wanted him to call for medical assistance. Kessler cut him off before Simone could answer, saying there was no need to make a scene over a registration check. Officer Reyes hesitated, glanced at his sergeant's patrol car parked down the block, and then straightened back up without pressing the issue further. The kind of small silence that, looking back, would haunt him more than he expected. Simone would remember that hesitation for a long time afterward, not with anger, but with a kind of tired understanding of how easily good instincts get talked out of themselves. And then, less than a minute later, Simone's body betrayed her in the worst possible way. Her arms jerked, her eyes rolled back. A woman walking her dog across the street screamed and dropped the leash, already reaching for her phone to dial emergency services. For the first time that morning, Wade Kessler's confident posture cracked, just slightly, just enough for a flicker of real fear to cross his face. Though even then, his first instinct was not compassion. It was the sudden, sick realization that he might be in serious trouble. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, though to the small crowd gathering on the sidewalk, it felt like an hour. As they lifted Simone onto the stretcher, one of them noticed the manila folder that had spilled out of the sport utility vehicle's back seat when the door was opened for evidence photographs. Patterns and Practices Review, the label read, and beneath it a list of names, dates, and badge numbers that included, near the very bottom of the 3rd page, the number 4127, Wade Kessler's own badge. Nobody understood the full weight of that folder yet. Not the paramedics, not the bystanders, not even Kessler, who was too busy trying to explain himself to Sergeant Poole to notice what had just been photographed as evidence. At the hospital, the emergency room staff worked quickly, hooking Simone up to monitors that beeped out her elevated blood pressure in numbers the attending physician read aloud with visible concern. 160/110, the doctor said. We need to get this under control immediately. Simone drifted in and out of full awareness for the first several hours, catching fragments of conversation, a nurse asking about her due date, another voice mentioning magnesium sulfate to prevent further seizures, and somewhere in the background, a phone ringing that she would later learn was her sister calling every 20 minutes for updates. Simone was rushed to St. Augustine Memorial Hospital, where doctors immediately began treating her for severe preeclampsia, monitoring both her and her unborn daughter around the clock. It was there, 3 days later, sitting beside her hospital bed with his hat in his hands, that Marcus Desacroix finally learned the truth he had been circling for months without ever quite reaching it. He had come to the hospital the moment he heard what happened to his housekeeper, partly out of basic human decency, and partly because something about the incident had shaken him in a way he could not name. Sitting beside her bed, watching her sleep, he noticed the turtle pendant resting against her collarbone up close for the first time, close enough to see the small, nearly worn-away engraving on its underside, 2 initials intertwined, an M and a D. Marcus Delacroix had given a necklace exactly like that one to a woman named Dolores Carter 26 years earlier, back when he was a young real estate agent with nothing but ambition and a heart that belonged, fully and completely, to a woman his own mother believed was beneath the family name. His mother had lied to them both, separately, telling Marcus that Dolores had left town with another man, and telling Dolores that Marcus had chosen his family's money over her. Neither of them had ever learned the truth, not until Marcus sat in a hospital chair a quarter of a century later, staring at a turtle pendant on the collarbone of a young woman whose face, he suddenly realized with a chill running down his spine, carried the exact same eyes as the woman he had never stopped loving. When Simone woke up, groggy and disoriented, Marcus asked her, gently, where she had gotten the necklace. She told him the same story her mother had always told her, about a rich man who had abandoned them before she was even born. Marcus asked one more question, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was your mother's name?" "Dolores Carter," Simone answered. Marcus Delacroix did not say another word for almost a full minute. He simply sat there, his hands trembling slightly. 26 years of grief and confusion rearranging themselves into a single, impossible realization. Marcus stayed by her bedside that entire first night, long after visiting hours had technically ended, quietly asking the nursing staff if he could simply sit in the corner chair without disturbing anyone. He thought about the years he had spent building an empire out of steel and concrete and glass, and how none of it had ever filled the particular emptiness that settled into him every single year on Dolores's birthday, a date he still remembered with a precision that embarrassed him. He thought about his own mother, gone now for over a decade, and the conversation he never got to have with her about the letters she had intercepted and the lies she had told two frightened young people who loved each other and trusted her word over their own hearts. A paternity test was arranged within the week, quietly, respectfully, at Marcus's insistence that Simone never feel pressured or rushed. He told her, more than once, that she owed him nothing, that the test existed only to give her certainty, not to give him a claim on her life. The results came back 11 days later, confirming what both of them had already begun to feel in their bones. Marcus Delacroix was Simone Carter's biological father. When he read the results out loud to her over the phone, his voice broke halfway through the sentence, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The silence between them, saying more than either could have managed with words. While that private reunion was unfolding inside a hospital room, a much larger reckoning was unfolding inside the offices of the Magnolia Bluff Homeowners Association and the county's Internal Affairs Division. The photographs taken at the scene of Simone's arrest had triggered an automatic review, standard procedure anytime a pregnant woman suffered a medical emergency in police custody. That review pulled Pearl Simmons's folder into official evidence. And once investigators began reading through 23 separate documented complaints against Officer Wade Kessler, stretching back nearly 3 years, the case moved quickly from a routine review into a formal investigation. Security footage from the community's own gate cameras, footage Sergeant Gary Poole had personally overseen for years, showed a consistent and troubling pattern once investigators finally looked at it without an insider trying to protect his nephew. Kessler stopped black residents and their guests at a rate nearly 6 times higher than any other vehicle passing through that same gate. Internal emails, recovered during the investigation, showed that Sergeant Poole had quietly closed out or downgraded at least 11 prior complaints against his nephew without ever forwarding them to the County Review Board, a violation that put his own 22-year career in serious jeopardy. Simone, still recovering, was asked to give a formal statement. She did, calmly and honestly, without asking for anything in return. An investigator from the district attorney's office sat with her for nearly 2 hours, and at one point asked whether she wanted to add anything about how the incident had made her feel expecting, perhaps, a statement full of anger. Instead, Simone simply said that she hoped nobody else's daughter would ever have to explain from a hospital bed why her own fear had not been enough to be believed. She had spent 2 years cleaning floors for people who barely looked her in the eye, and even now, even as the truth about her father unfolded around her like something out of a dream she had never allowed herself to have, she remained the same person she had always been, steady, honest, unwilling to exaggerate a single detail for sympathy or effect. Pearl Simmons, once she learned that her quiet months of documentation had become the very evidence that broke the case wide open, drove to the hospital herself to see Simone in person. She sat by the bed for almost an hour, telling Simone that she had started collecting those statements after her own nephew had been stopped 4 times in a single year driving through that same gate, never once given a reason that made sense. "I did not know it would end up saving somebody's life," Pearl said quietly. Simone reached over and squeezed her hand, and for a moment, neither of them needed to say anything else. Wade Kessler was placed on unpaid administrative leave within days and formally terminated 3 weeks later, following a county review board hearing that included testimony from 3 other women who had experienced strikingly similar treatment at his hands over the years. Women who had never filed formal complaints because, as one of them put it during her testimony, nobody ever believed us before. One of those women, a school teacher named Renata Ellison, who lived 2 streets over from the Delacroix estate, described being stopped by Kessler twice in the same month for what he called mismatched vehicle descriptions, both times in her own driveway. Her testimony, delivered in a steady, unshaken voice, became one of the most cited pieces of evidence in the entire hearing, precisely because she asked for nothing beyond being heard. Kessler was later charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal charge tied to reckless endangerment, after prosecutors argued that his refusal to acknowledge Simone's documented medical condition directly contributed to her seizure. Sergeant Gary Poole resigned before his own hearing could take place, forfeiting his pension in the process, a consequence that even Marcus Delacroix, once he learned the full story, quietly noted was not nearly steep enough for a man who had spent 2 decades protecting a pattern instead of the people it hurt. Marcus did not stop there. Once the investigation confirmed everything Pearl Simmons had spent months documenting, he used his position on the Magnolia Bluff Homeowners Association Board to push through a full independent audit of the community's private security contracts. The audit, conducted by an outside firm with no ties to the association or the county, took 3 months to complete and confirmed what residents like Pearl had been saying for years, that complaints filed by Black residents were resolved at less than half the rate of complaints filed by white residents, and that internal review files had gone missing or unfiled at a rate that suggested more than simple administrative error. Within 4 months, the association had signed onto a new oversight agreement, mandatory de-escalation and implicit bias training for every officer working the gates, a 24-hour hotline for residents to report concerns directly to an outside review panel, and a written policy requiring immediate medical attention for any detained individual who reported a pregnancy or a documented medical condition. No exceptions, no discretion left to the officer on the scene. Marcus insisted that the training program be named, quietly and without any public announcement attached to his own name, after nobody in particular, simply called the Community Trust Initiative, because he did not want the reform to look like an apology tour. He wanted it to look like the standard it always should have been. Simone gave birth to a healthy baby girl 8 weeks later, a little girl she named Dolores after her mother, who was, for the first time in years, finally receiving the kind of advanced medical care that only came with real financial security. Transferred to one of the best nephrology programs in the entire state under Marcus's insistence and expense. 6 weeks after the paternity results were confirmed, Marcus sat Simone down in his study, the same room where she had once dusted the shelves, without ever imagining she might one day sit in one of its leather chairs as his daughter rather than his employee. He slid a folder across the desk toward her, thick with legal documents his attorneys had spent days preparing. Inside was an offer most people would consider an unimaginable gift. Full access to the Delacroix family fortune, a public announcement naming her as his heir, a life where she would never have to clean another floor again as long as she lived. Simone surprised everyone in the room, including herself a little. She said no, not because she did not want a relationship with her father. She wanted that more than she had words for. But she asked him instead for something much smaller and, to her, much more valuable. She asked him to help her return to law school, to finish what her mother's illness had once forced her to abandon, so that she could become the lawyer she had always wanted to be, using her own hands, her own work, her own name. She asked him to help her mother, fully and without condition, and when he tried gently, to replace the old tarnished turtle pendant with a brand new one made of real silver and set with a small diamond. Simone shook her head and kept the original one instead. It recognized who I was, she told him, even when I did not know myself. I am not ready to let it go. Andre Booker, the driver who had never asked for anything and never expected anything in return, was the one who drove Simone to her first day back at law school the following fall. Baby Dolores strapped into a car seat in the back, the same turtle pendant resting quietly against Simone's collarbone. When they pulled up in front of the law building, Andre turned around in his seat and told her, simply, that he had a feeling about her from the very first week she started at the estate, though he never could have guessed how far that feeling would go. Simone laughed for what felt like the first time in years, thanked him, and walked up the front steps, carrying both her daughter's future and her own back into the same building she had once believed she would never see again. Dolores Carter, meanwhile, continued her treatment under the care of a nephrology team that specialized in exactly her condition, and within a year, doctors began discussing the real possibility of a kidney transplant, something that had felt impossibly out of reach only 12 months earlier. Marcus visited her regularly, not as a benefactor writing checks from a distance, but as a man finally allowed to sit beside the woman he had never stopped loving and simply talk about small things, about the years they had lost, about the daughter and granddaughter who now filled a house that had been quiet for far too long. If you take one thing away from this story, let it be this. The point was never that a poor young woman turned out, in the end, to be the secret daughter of a wealthy man. Stories like that are easy to enjoy and easy to forget. The real point, the thing worth carrying with you long after this video ends, is that every single person you encounter, whether they are cleaning your floors, standing behind a counter, or sitting handcuffed on a sidewalk pleading for someone to listen, deserves basic human dignity before you ever learn a single thing about who they are or where they came from. Respect should never depend on discovering that someone turns out to be important. It should have been there from the very beginning, simply because they are a person. I want to be honest with you before you go. I did not write this story to convince you that every wealthy man is secretly waiting to make things right, or that every difficult situation resolves itself into a happy ending this neatly. Real life is rarely that generous. I wrote it because the feeling underneath the story, the ache of being dismissed before anyone bothers to ask your name, is something a great many people carry with them long after the cameras stop rolling and the paperwork gets filed away. If this story gave you something to sit with, even for a few minutes, then it did what I hoped it would do. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real patterns that continue to affect real families across this country. Patterns of racial profiling, of medical neglect, and of institutions protecting the wrong people for far too long. The names, the places, and the specific events in this story are entirely invented, created for the purpose of storytelling and reflection, not as an account of any real individual or law enforcement agency. If anything in this story resonated with you, I would gently encourage you to look into organizations in your own community that support maternal health equity and police accountability. Because behind every fictional story like this one are countless real experiences that deserve to be heard, believed, and acted upon, long before anyone finds out who someone's father happens to be. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If it moved you even a little, consider sharing it with someone who needs the reminder that kindness should never be conditional.